So here we are in the demo environment. It's very simple for the purposes of this demonstration. We just have a single server running SharePoint Server 2019. We also have a couple of web applications already configured, the intranet and OneDrive. The intranet, fairly standard stuff, just using the standard team site template. Here's a user's OneDrive, and of course we have the SharePoint home, which is hosted in the my site host, and that's the two web applications that we're going to configure to use Azure AD for sign-in. So the first step to configure that is to go ahead and log into the Azure admin portal and then go to Azure AD, and we're going to use enterprise applications for this. So we'll click into here. You can see there's already some configured in this tenancy. I'm going to go ahead and choose new application. Now on this screen we have these three panels at the top. Now in the past we would have done this manually using a non-gallery application, but you'll notice that it warns us here that this requires Azure AD Premium to use this. So we're going to instead choose the on-premises application gallery, and if we type in SharePoint into the text box here, you can see that we have one called SharePoint On Premises. So we'll go ahead and select that and then give it a name, and then we'll add that application. So it takes us to this overview screen. I'm going to go ahead into the properties and just update the icon for this particular application, just to make it a little bit easier to see what's going on within the rest of the screens. So once we've updated that, we can see the icon has been changed there. The next step is then to choose the single sign-in blade, and we'll choose the SAML panel. This gives us a setup screen. The first panel here, number one, the basic SAML configuration, is the one that requires us to make some changes. So we'll go ahead and click edit, and I'll enter the sign-in URL for my intranet, which is intranet.fabricam.com_trust default.aspx. I'm actually going to pop that into the reply URL as well. We don't need to change the entity ID, that's all been pre-populated for us by the gallery template. So we'll go ahead and hit save on this configuration. Once we have that configuration, we need to grab a couple of extra details from this screen. If we go to the SAML signing certificate section, we need to download the certificate which we'll use later to create the trust between SharePoint On Premises and Azure AD. So I'm going to copy that file to the root of my C drive. And we also need the login URL, which is in the setup and then with whatever the name of the application is. So we'll copy that to the clipboard. Now the next stage is to configure our trusted identity provider within SharePoint On Premises. So to do that we need to use PowerShell. I have this sample script here with some variables preset. You can see here's the certificate, and then here's our sign-in URL. So I just need to update this value here to the one that I copied from the Azure AD portal. Now you'll notice at the end here the default includes SAML2 at the end of the URL. Now SharePoint On Premises doesn't support SAML2, so we need to change this to WSFed. Then we can go ahead and run this script, which will go ahead and import that certificate into the SharePoint trusts, and we can view that in Central Administration just by going to Security, Manage Trust. You can see that it's created the trust there with Azure AD. The next step is to create the claims provider itself, or rather the trusted identity provider. Now this sample script uses basic claims mappings. We could make those a bit more involved if we wish to, and we'll see more about those later on. So this step is basically created a trusted identity provider. Now back on Central Admin, we can go ahead and pick our intranet web application, choose authentication providers, click into here, and we should now see the identity provider is listed, and I'm going to go ahead and select that there. For the moment, I'm going to leave the sign-in URL with the default, which will mean the user will be prompted which identity provider they wish to use when signing in. And I'm going to go ahead and save these changes. Now, this user interface doesn't give us any indication of what's happening. It's an interesting little bug here. If we go to IIS and look at sites, we'll see that Central Admin is actually stopped. So I'm going to start that again, and if I do that quick enough, then this page will return eventually once the changes have been made. This is an area where you can use, of course, PowerShell to configure this instead and avoid the problem. So now that's complete, if we actually go back in, we'll be able to see the changes have actually been persisted there. Now, one of the things that most of the walkthroughs will talk about is adding a user policy to the web application. This is not a required step. There's no need to do this, and we really shouldn't. But one of the implications of any customs claims provider is that no matter what we type in here now, it's going to resolve the results. And as you can see, we've searched for Hans Christian Andersen here. He's a great guy and everything, but he probably wasn't really a SharePoint guy. He's probably more of a Teams guy. And the problem here is because we don't have any claims provider installed, we can resolve whatever we want here. And this causes a lot of problems for end users with typos and things like that. So we'll see how to resolve that a little later on. So I'm just going to cancel out of here. Now, the next step is to assign users to our enterprise application. So we'll switch back to Azure AD, and we'll go to the users and groups section here. And I'm going to go ahead and choose add users. Again, because I'm using Azure AD Basic for this demonstration, I can't use groups, but I can go ahead and add users directly. So we have some sample users here that we'll add in. So we'll select those 3 users, and then we'll assign the users to this enterprise application. Oops, I forgot one of the users there. So we'll do that. And see our 3 users are now able to use this enterprise application. So I'm going to go ahead and test this by loading a new Chrome browser window, but this time in a different identity. This is the identity set for Miles Davis, and I'm going to go ahead and attempt to access the intranet. Because I updated the authentication providers, the application pool has been reset, hence the slight delay there. So now you can see this selection screen. I'm going to pick Azure AD. It's then going to take me across to the Azure AD sign-in experience, so enter the password. Now, of course, at this stage I haven't actually added that user to the SharePoint site collection, so in a few minutes I'm going to see the SharePoint access capability. So we'll just type in a message here. Send that request. So the request is now pending. I'm going to go back in as the site collection administrator. Eventually, I'm going to go back in as the site collection administrator. go ahead and approve that request. Check that that's taken. Okay, so now if I come back over here to the Miles Davis browser, select the authentication again, and this logs me in, so now it's all working. Now, of course, we have multiple web applications in this SharePoint farm, and I'd like to use Azure AD for both of those. So in order to support that, we need to add an additional reply URL. So the way we do that is if we come to our Azure AD root blade and choose App Registrations, you can see that there's been one there created for us automatically when we created the gallery application. So we'll click on that, go into the settings, go to the reply URL section, and then I'll go ahead and add in another reply URL for the OneDrive web application. Save the changes. I also need to tell SharePoint about that, and the way we do that is set the properties of the trusted identity provider with the use reply parameter. Now we've done that, we can go ahead and configure the web application itself. Oops. So again, go into the authentication providers and select our trusted identity provider, save the changes. We'll do our little trick with IIS one more time. And in a few moments this should be complete. So if I now switch over to the Miles Davis browser, I can go ahead and select OneDrive. Again, the delay here is caused by updating the web application, so there's an app pull reset. And so what we should see in a second is the standard experience when the user first goes to the My Site. So it's going to go ahead and create that site collection. And so you can see now that we're signing in as that Azure AD user to both web applications. It's quite important from a planning perspective to understand the implications and the relationship between the SharePoint services on premises and these Azure AD identities. If we take a look at the user profile and do a search for Davis M, the username, you'll see that we have our Azure AD identifier and then obviously the account name there at the end as well. So just bear that in mind from a planning point of view. So the last step is to fix this people picker. And this is a task we need to do with every trusted identity provider. Luckily for Azure AD, we have a very good sample solution that's available that deals with virtually all of the issues for us. Now I've already installed this in this farm, and it's a farm solution, it's good old WSP. You can see it here, it's not deployed. I'm going to go ahead and deploy that solution. And this is probably the only time that you'll see a full trust code at this conference. They do still have their place, and this is an example of somewhere where it's absolutely required. So we'll wait for this to deploy to the web applications. and you can see that this is now deployed. Once this is available, I need to associate the claims provider with the trusted identity provider. If I go into the security section, you see that Azure CP has added this section here, and the global configuration will actually warn us that it doesn't have an association at present. So again, switch to PowerShell, and we'll go ahead and connect the claims provider to the identity provider. We'll always see an update conflict warning here at this stage. We don't need to worry about that for the purposes of this demonstration. So if I refresh this screen, now the warning will go away, and I can go ahead and configure the rest of the settings here. The first one is the tenant name, so that's my Azure AD tenant, and it's asking for an application ID and secret. So as you might imagine, in order to configure this, I need another app registration within Azure AD. So I'm going to go back to here and choose a new application registration. Just give this a name. And we don't care about the sign-on URL, so we're just going to put a dummy one in there. Click Create, and I'm going to copy this application ID here and pop that into the Azure CP configuration screen over on SharePoint. I also need some settings here in this app registration. The first one is the required permissions. So this allows us to select which permissions this registration has on the Azure AD. So I'm going to choose Read Directory Data, and I'm going to unselect Sign-in. So this is the only one we need for the purposes of what we're using it for. So I'm going to save that, and then importantly I'm going to grant the permissions for them to take effect. I also need a secret or password, so I'm going to go to Keys and create a new one in here. Oops. Set that to be a couple of years. When I save it, the key is generated, and I'm going to copy that. And this is the only time I have access to this. If I move away from this blade, I won't be able to see this key. I'd need to create another one. So I'm just going to copy that from here and pop that into the secret on this screen, and then choose Add Tenant. Now you can see that the AD tenant is connected to the Azure Claims Provider. If I scroll down here, we have some other settings that can be used to configure the Claims Provider. I'm going to stick with all the defaults for the moment. Click OK. We also have another screen here which is pretty nice. Allows us to manage and view the claims mappings. We configured these with PowerShell earlier, but this screen gives us a user interface to edit them and so on and so forth. Very useful customization. So at this stage I should now be able to go ahead and test the people picker and see if things have been improved. So I'm going to go back over to our permissions screen here, bring up the members group, and if we've done everything correctly, we should now only see results from users that actually exist in Azure AD. So if I do a search for Hans here, you can see that there's no results found. But if I do a search for Duke, you see the user from Azure AD, and they have the little pop-up there that actually shows which identity provider the user is coming from. If I do a search for Miles, you see that we actually get two results. There's the one user which is coming from Azure AD, and then the second user is actually in the on-premises Active Directory. Two different principles. So there we go. The configuration is very, very straightforward and simple. Another thing that we can use which is useful is the Azure Access Panel. I have this installed here as a Chrome extension, and if I just sign in here, it's going to take me to app screen where you can see that I have the enterprise application here. You can click on that, take me directly to the intranet. So this is a useful utility for switching identities and testing the configuration of the enterprise application. Thanks for listening.